Hello and thanks for joining us on Encore. Coming up on today's film show, Dancing to the Rhythm of Life, Beats Per Minute revisits the AIDS crisis of the 1990s. Sofia Coppola turns her lens on a Civil War tale with The Beguiled, and we look back at the man considered a slapstick genius here in France. Jerry Lewis has died aged 91.
Ensemble, nous pouvons construire une communauté capable d'adopter à l'égard de la maladie une attitude positive et combative.
It seems the enemy is not what we believe.
Well, for all of that, I'm joined by film critic Lisa Nesselson. Hi, Lisa.
Hello, Olivia.
We're starting with a film that won the Grand Prix at the Cannes Film Festival this year. It's getting a lot of attention in the French press, and it's called BPM, or Beats Per Minute. It's the story of the French branch of ACT UP, the group lobbying the government during the AIDS crisis of the early 90s. Now, it is primarily a French movie, but do you think it has broader resonance?
The answer to that is both. It is an incredibly French movie because it's very, very talky and full of testy procedural moments and people taking each other to task. But it's ultimately incredibly moving as well, and universal and informative, because it shows us how far we have come. In the late 1980s, early 1990s here in France, AIDS was seen as an unfortunate offshoot consequence of unfortunate lifestyle choices. But you didn't have to be promiscuous to become HIV positive. We know that now. Plenty of people were infected the very first time they had sex, or a blood transfusion, men, women, young, old, medical professionals, as an indication of just what a big deal this is, this film. This is Libération, a daily newspaper. This has 28 pages. 13 of them, including the cover, are devoted to this film, which is out this week, and to the history of ACT UP here in France. Director Robin Campillo was actually a member of ACT UP from the very start, and so he knows intimately what the stakes were. The film was extremely well received in Cannes, but a lot of the veteran protesters rankled in retrospect because the way their efforts had been treated at the time. Now everyone's acting like it's all warm and fuzzy and they were heroes, but they want people to know they were pariahs. And it's a touching testimonial to what dedicated people really can accomplish when they're motivated, and these activists were very, very motivated. There's that expression about how knowing you're going to be hanged in the morning is a wonderful way to focus the mind. Now, the members of ACT UP were obnoxious, but the film makes a case for why that was absolutely called for in a time of AIDS. If you've forgotten, that stands for Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome. The French acronym is SIDA, S-I-D-A. Let's take a look.
Nous vivons le sida comme une guerre invisible aux yeux des autres. Pourtant nos amis meurent, et nous ne voulons pas mourir. Nous nous battons contre ceux pour qui l'épidémie est une aubaine, car elle tue depuis plus de 10 ans dans l'indifférence générale.
Je vais résumer la situation. Melton Pharm a décidé d'orchestrer une pénurie de traitements afin de faire parler de sa nouvelle molécule. Et intensifier l'effet d'annonce, on va augmenter la pression et on obtiendra de toute façon les médicaments pour les gens qui en ont besoin.
Ensemble, nous pouvons unir nos forces pour résister à l'épidémie et aux problèmes sociaux qu'elle engendre.
So activism is obviously a huge part of this film, but what stuck with you most about the film?
Something that jumped out at me is how silly and reductive it is to speak about so-called communities, as in the Black community, the Jewish community, here the gay community. We get to know a ragtag but committed group of protesters who stage pretty radical events together to push for faster implementation of drugs, for education, to let people know how the virus is transmitted. To do that, you have to talk about it and to practice safe sex. Most of them are gay, but there's a mother and her hemophiliac son who, in a very nice piece of symbolism, are the ones who actually mix up the fake blood in their bathtub that they then put in pouches and, you know, hurl at people that they think aren't moving fast enough. But all of the people in the group are individuals. They cannot and should not just be reduced to members of the gay community. And because these are wonderfully drawn characters, they're as varied as can be. Some are shy, some are brash and difficult. Only quite a ways into the film do we even learn what the professions are of the core members of the group. What's salutary is the progress that's been made. French authorities went from not even wanting to mention condoms to making them incredibly affordable or giving them out for free. Thanks to ACT UP, anyone who is HIV positive now has access to costly tri-therapy drugs as part of the health system. We're very much in an era of renewed, vigorous protest. There's a lot to protest, especially in my country, the USA. Free speech is always worth fighting for, but what we see in this film really was a matter of life and death.
Indeed, has changed in the last 25 years. But what about this title then, BPM, or beats per minute? What's that referring to?
Well, the French title, which is way more specific, translates as 120 beats per minute, and I'm told that's a reference to the rhythm of music that you cannot help moving your body to. You just have to get up and dance. And there are passages of people dancing, and I often wonder about people who don't like going to clubs and don't like dancing. Where does that leave them? So anyway, people's hearing may still be at risk, but at least in the West, being HIV positive is no longer a death sentence, and this film helps show us why.
Yeah, there's certainly lots of joie de vivre in that film. I do remember that. Now, another film that was presented in competition at Cannes this year is Sofia Coppola's The Beguiled. It's set during the American Civil War, a very dark chapter of history, of course, that's in the news again recently with the events of Charlottesville, Virginia. It seems quite apt.
Indeed. Personally, I think it makes way more sense to leave statues where they are, but just modify the plaques, put them in context. For example, there's a really large statue of Danton across from where I live here in Paris. There's a street named for him not far away. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was written in a cellar a few blocks away, and Dr. Guillotin invented his guillotine around the corner. Heads rolled during the French Revolution. It was like totally violent and really upsetting, but I think it's good to keep that in mind and in perspective. The United States was embroiled in a long and devastating civil war over, in simple terms, whether slavery was an essential economic approach or an abomination. You pick. I leave that up to you. Anyway, The Beguiled is Sofia Coppola's take on a book that was made into a very interesting film back in 1971, starring Clint Eastwood in the role played here by Colin Farrell. And in the film, the boarding house for girls, for young ladies, run by Nicole Kidman, is an oasis of civility and decorum. It's not at all clear whether the South will even survive, let alone rise again. So they live in their unmolested enclave, following daily discipline, which includes that old standby conjugating French verbs.
While wearing lovely dresses.
While wearing lovely, incredibly clean dresses. When one of the girls finds a wounded soldier in the road, in the woods, it's not paved there, in the woods, she brings him into the all-female household to be nursed back to health, because that is the Christian thing to do, whether a soldier happens to be a Yankee or a rebel. The soldier is at death's door, literally at their mercy. He's also handsome and charming. I have to say, I have always wanted to say cock in the hen house on TV. Let's take a look at an excellent cast in those perhaps too clean outfits. Let's look.
Seen the original film years and years ago and was kind of somewhat haunted by it. And it's an incredibly strong and provocative piece of filmmaking, I feel. But I didn't think about it. I knew Sofia's take was going to be different.
Well, in all my travels, I've never come across such a delicate beauty as yours. Tell me something, will you? Miss Morrow. It's okay. If you could have anything, what's your biggest wish? If you could have anything in the world, what would it be?
Anything.
Yeah, anything.
To be taken far away from me.
So this film actually won Sofia Coppola the Best Director prize in Cannes. Did it deserve it, in your opinion?
I'm generally a pacifist, but I might be willing to take up arms to get people to stop giving prizes and awards to Sofia Coppola. She won Best Director in Cannes for this, which is like me winning Best Dressed. And everybody exclaimed that it's somehow cause for celebration because she's only the second woman ever to win the Best Director award in Cannes. And that would be great news if she really had been the Best Director in this year's lineup. But she wasn't. The jury was mistaken about that. She's female, she's a director, she's made several films. Let's leave it at that. Okay. That said, this is the first of her films that I actually was able to watch from start to finish without becoming bored or irritated. Interestingly, many of my France 24 colleagues in their 20s and 30s thought it was one of the worst movies they'd ever seen.
And
They weren't buying the florid Gothic language or setting for a minute. And it's hard for me to talk about it with a straight face now because they've convinced me of that. I actually thought it was well done and intentionally funny in places. And Sofia, who despite her privileged background, I think is still shopping for a speck of personal charisma, said something that cracked me up in an interview with IndieWire during the festival. I quote, "There's actually a plot and dialogue, which is unusual for me," end quote.
And what about the context of the film? Because it is set in the South during the Civil War, and there has been some complaints that it's all white characters.
You know, that doesn't bother me in the least. She said that she didn't want to have a token black servant because she might not, get the balance right. The characters we do see may have white skin, but they are by no means free. They haven't been abducted from Africa and put into bondage, but there are an enormous number of restrictions on their lives, so that doesn't bother me.
Okay. Now, finally, the film industry is saying goodbye to someone who was an actor, a director, a writer, a producer, a singer, inventor, and philanthropist, of course, Jerry Lewis. He died in Las Vegas, aged 91. It turns out that opinions on him are quite divided. He's long been celebrated here in France, and they don't understand why in the US.
Well, I would have to say for several generations now, Jerry Lewis has been a sort of shorthand for saying, but the French are absolute idiots and you shouldn't listen to a word they say. How does this go? Well, the French this, and that. Yeah, but the French think Jerry Lewis is a genius. And that dates back to 50, 60 years ago. There are two rival film magazines here in France. You may have heard of Cahiers du Cinéma. There's also Positif, which is the more entertaining sense of humor one, rooted in surrealism. And one of the few directors that they both agree on is Jerry Lewis. The film critic for Le Figaro wrote that if God is French, when Jerry Lewis arrives, he'll be greeted with a red carpet and all sorts of fanfare. But if God is American, he's going to be waiting, tapping his foot and saying, "Okay, I've been waiting. Can you tell me why the French think you're a genius?" Part of that is that he really is an auteur. He did absolutely everything, wrote, directed, starred. He came up with an invention. You may not think he's a comic genius, but he was a genius in that he invented something for filmmaking that is still used to this day. We know it as video assist. In 1960, on his own film, The Bellboy, he thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could see what the cameraman is seeing through the camera? Because in those days, film ran through the camera and you had to develop it in order to see what you had. So he thought, if we have a video monitor, I can watch the actors and also know what they're doing and know whether we got the shot.
Fantastic for the film industry. We'll leave you then with a clip from Lewis's take on that aspirational fairy tale, his 1960 movie Cinderella. Thanks for joining us, Lisa, and thanks to you at home for watching. Remember, you can get more arts and culture on our website, and you can keep up with Encore on social media too. There's more news coming up on France 24 after this.